Hello, hello, hello. Welcome to the Productivity Show, a podcast where we believe that you can get everything done without having to sacrifice your health, family, and things that matter to you. This is Tam Pham. I'm the founder and CEO of Asian Efficiency, where we help people become more productive at work and in life. And today I'm joined by my co-host, Brooks Duncan. How are you today, Brooks?
I'm excellent. How's it going today?
It's cold and rainy here in Austin, Texas, where I'm currently residing. And I can kind of start relating to you, Brooks, in many ways, coming from Vancouver, British Columbia, where I think this is probably the case like 80% of the year, right?
Cold and rainy is what we do best here. Yes, that's true.
So today's episode is going to be slightly different than what you might be used to from us. One of the things we're known for at the Productivity Show is that we always like to make things actionable for you, and today is going to be no different. However, today we're going to be trying a slightly different format because we're always looking for ways, kaizening our way through making the podcast better, more fun, and more insightful as well. So it's still going to be actionable, but today we're going to be talking about what's been going on in the news lately. And there's this phenomenon going on called the Great Resignation. You might have heard of it. This is a big thing going on in the United States, and I see this happening across the world as well, where people are just leaving their jobs intentionally, often without another job lining up. And this is impacting you. This is impacting everyone else around you as well. And we thought it would be an interesting podcast episode to talk about, because how is this impacting you, and what can you do to address stuff like this happening in around your workplace, around you, in your family life? Because we see 1 in 14 employees in the accommodations and food services just left their job in a single month. And it's not limited to that particular industry at all. I don't know about you, Brooks, but anytime I go out for dinner somewhere or I talk to other business owners, everyone's talking about like nobody wants to work right now. Like we're so understaffed. And this is making a big impact because people are essentially saying, hey, I don't like my job. I'm unhappy. I'm going to quit and I'm going to do something else. I'm even not sure what that might be. And the reason this is an important topic is because one of the things we always like to say at Asian Efficiency is that happy people are productive people. And so if you're not happy at work, in other words, you are unhappy, then it's just really difficult and challenging to be productive. So what can we do to address this? Well, that is what today's episode is all about. So whether you're an employee, manager, boss, or consumer, we're going to go over how the Great Resignation is impacting you and what you can do about moving forward to have a happy and productive life. You can find links to everything that we share in the show notes. We're going to theproductivityshow.com/380. But as always, we like to start off with our top 3 favorite resources before we start diving in here. And Brooks, would you mind sharing your favorite resources as of lately?
Yeah, so the first resource is a book. It's by Kim Scott, and it's called Radical Candor. Be a kick-ass boss without losing your humanity. And a lot of things we're going to be talking about today is about the relationship between employees and managers or bosses that can contribute to this Great Resignation stuff that we're going to be talking about today. And I think this is a great book for giving you a framework. And it's good to read from the employee standpoint as well, even if you're not a boss, of a more holding people accountable, but also doing it in an ethical way. So Radical Candor is the first book. The second one is not a book. It's the Logitech Brio 4K webcam. So this is a question we get a lot on the Productivity Show is, what should I use if I'm working from home? What kind of webcam is good? And there's lots of different great ones. The one I personally use is the Logitech Brio. So if you're watching any videos from us, watching stuff from us on YouTube, I personally am using the Logitech Brio, and it's a pretty reasonably priced, but high quality webcam. So that's the second one. And the third one, speaking of cold and wet weather, is the Nikwax TX Direct Wash-In Waterproofing. So this is probably not something you need a lot in Austin, although every time I go to Austin, somehow there's a big rainstorm. But in Vancouver, in the Pacific Northwest in general, we definitely love our waterproof clothing. But what you might not know is if you buy something like a waterproof jacket, eventually it needs to be re-waterproof. Those coatings that are on it will wear off over time. So the Nikwax TX Direct Wash-In Waterproofing is a way that you can regenerate the waterproofing on your jacket, which is something I'm in the process of doing. So I thought I would share that as one of my top 3 resources. And we like to end the top 3 resources section with giving a teaser to our next episode. So the next episode we're going to be doing is called How to Do a Calendar Cleanup. So we're going to be talking about the calendar, one of our favorite topics here at the Productivity Show, and ways you can do a cleanup, get it back on track, and get ready for what you need to do.
So, Brooks, the Great Resignation, today's topic for today's episode. And yeah, I kind of want to start diving in and talking about this with you, like how this is happening, what exactly is going on, why is it happening? I'm curious to hear your take on this and how you kind of see this playing out and how this is affecting the average TPS listener as well.
Well, you're definitely right. You mentioned earlier about restaurants and how they're not having enough staff. And I think restaurants and retail is definitely where you kind of like see it it's the most visible, I guess I would say. Like, for example, last weekend, my wife and I went shopping at the Patagonia store in the west end of Vancouver, or west side of Vancouver. And it was actually closed between 2 to 3 p.m. because they didn't have any staff to work. And this is like a major retail store on a major retail street. I've never seen that before in my life. And this is the sort of things that's happening, but it's, like I said, restaurants and retail is the most visible, but it's definitely not the only place where this is happening. I know, for example, I was just talking to my wife, and the company she works for, she's a marketing director, just sent an email to their staff saying, hey, like, we are super understaffed. We're hiring for all these positions. We have like really big referral bonuses if you can get people in. And referral bonuses have always been a thing. I've certainly received them and caused other people to receive them over the years. But I feel like now it's becoming more and more prominent, and it's something that is happening not just for those like high tech jobs, but all sorts of different jobs as well. I've read a few studies, and for example, I read one by PricewaterhouseCoopers, and they were saying 65% of US employees are looking for a new job. And sometimes you read different stats. Like that one is the highest one I've seen. I've seen like 50s, 40s, but the kind of like point is that in all sectors, it's starting to churn. And I think when it comes to like TPS listeners and corporate listeners, I think what I see talking to people and hearing what people are saying is a lot of it was like it's kind of been building for a long time, but a lot of it has been triggered by COVID and that sort of thing, because a lot of people had a taste of working from home. Maybe their employers never allowed it before, but then of course people were forced to, and now they don't want to go back. So sometimes employers are trying to get people back into the office, and they're saying, no, if you're going to force me to do that, I'm out of here. I'm going to find somewhere, even if I maybe liked the job before, I'm going to find somewhere where I can have the situation that I want. And that's not really something that's happened before across the board.
I knew something was off here in Austin when I saw a Domino's Pizza. I had a sign that says a $500 sign-up bonus if you get hired for delivering pizzas. And I thought, damn, I've never seen that before, $500 sign-up bonus. Or if you were becoming an Amazon delivery person, you would get like a $1,500 sign-on bonus if you just came on. And that is unheard of. I've just never seen anything like that. And I kind of started to slowly see it happening over the last 6 months or so. Anytime I went to a restaurant or a retail store, you just saw that, talking to managers and talking to staff, that they always feel like overworked, and there's just not enough people wanting to come. Or one of my friends works and runs a staffing agency, and she has a hard time just recruiting people to come to staff all these events and things that are happening now that we're kind of slowly getting back to the normal life. And having talked to a lot of people who work in corporate America, it's very interesting to see how, the whole COVID thing kind of accelerated what was already going on, which is the transition to working from home, right? And a lot of traditional industries that used to think that you could never work from home now came to the realization that actually we can do things remote, right? So if you're, for example, in a law office, typically you would have people coming to the office, paperwork would be done, client meetings would be done, right? But then there was a time where we had to do everything online, everything had to be done over Zoom, and people found out, actually, yes, we can do that sort of stuff. And now we can work from home. And if you're telling me now that I have to go back to the office when I don't want to, that's where kind of like, I think a lot of this comes in. But also, I think a lot of people are realizing, one, that they're being underpaid for the work that they don't love to do. And I think this is maybe a generational thing as well, where millennials are now starting to see, hey, there is more to life than just working. Having access to social media, having access to a lot more information out there, seeing other people being able to live their life and live it in quote unquote a fantasy world, I think gives people a lot of pause to say, hey, I've been working so hard. Now I'm actually forced to pause due to COVID. And I'm actually realizing, hey, I actually don't have to do this work. I can actually do other stuff. So a lot of people are going back to school. A lot of people are doing online education. And it's literally affecting everyone, including you and I, both as consumers, but also people that we know personally, but also people that, are close to us that kind of like share these stories with us. And so if you're listening to this right now, like if you're an employee, you might be wondering, okay, I might not be in a position where I want to leave my job, but like, how does this still affect you? Well, imagine like half of your coworkers left right now, right? How would that affect your work? Guess what? You're probably going to be working more hours, right? You're probably going to be overwhelmed, and you're probably not going to be liking your job as much, especially if those people cannot be replaced. And then there's this huge domino effect where then you might go, well, do I want to stay in this job if that is happening, right? But you might also be listening and say, hey, Tan, I'm actually in that position where I go, I'm not so sure about my job. Like as part of the dojo or productivity academy as well, we have a private forum where our members can kind of share stories and questions. And one person actually asked, and they're like, hey, I'm actually working for a really big organization. I'm extremely productive, but no one else around me is. And I'm feeling like there's no growth potential. Do I stay here or do I go somewhere else? And I think people are now waking up to the fact that they have way more options than what we used to have. And I think that is opening up so many doors now for people to go, hey, you know what? I don't have to stay here because there's another option for me out there. Even though if I don't know what that is right now, if I'm not enjoying this work as much as I think I could enjoy it, maybe I should leave. And I can talk about, there's no such thing as the perfect job. And maybe we can talk about that a little bit later. But how do you see this playing out, Brooks, in terms of employees and coworkers?
Well, you mentioned TPS Plus and the dojo, and aside from the forum, we also have our members on the live stream with us. And one of our members, Giacomo, shares another example of the impact that this can have. And I've seen this in people that I know in their workplace is you have these people leaving because maybe either they don't have meaning in their work, or it's maybe a dysfunctional work environment that people used to put up with, but now they're not putting up with anymore. But then what happens is it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy in that all these people are leaving jobs. And then the people who are left behind, they all of a sudden have these things they have to fill, like roles they have to fill. And all of a sudden you have somebody who was maybe okay with their job before, may or may not have been, all of a sudden having to do the work of two people, sometimes even three people. And it's very, very difficult, especially when you're getting to these like high talent roles that have, maybe you're somebody who does marketing, but all of a sudden now you have to do product management, or at least fulfill the role of these different things, these product management, communications. You have to do all this stuff that maybe other people did before. And in some cases, it's making for leaner organizations, but in a lot of cases, leading to employee burnout, who then want to leave. So it almost, the more people leave, the more opportunities there are, but the more people want to leave. So yeah, it's an interesting cycle that I'm watching. You mentioned like millennials and Gen Z and stuff like that. And this is another difference that I've noticed as well is I think like I personally am Gen X, I guess I would be called. And I think my generation is maybe the last one who kind of like bought into the the thing where, you start at the bottom, you put in your time at the bottom, then you work up the rung up, then you work the rung up, then you work the rung up. And that's just like a normal thing that not a lot of people questioned. But now I think people are coming in, and there's a stereotype that that millennials are maybe like, you start in a new company, you start in a new job, and then 2 weeks later you're complaining because you're not included in the executive meetings or something like that. I don't think it's quite like that. And I think millennials and Gen Z get a bit too much stick for that type of stuff. I don't think that's quite accurate, but I do think that they tend to have a mindset of, hey, you guys are doing something a certain way. How come no one else notices that none of this stuff that you're doing makes sense? And tend to notice things, point things out, and suggest different ways of doing things that I think didn't happen as much before. And if those aren't being appreciated and acted on, then with this job shortage, all of a sudden they feel, well, I'll just go somewhere else that will listen to these ideas. So it's just fascinating for me.
Well, speaking of millennials, I'm technically a millennial myself, maybe a bit on the older side of millennials, but I am technically one. And it's funny, like running Asian efficiency as a company, what a lot of people don't know is I'm actually the youngest person in my own company. Everyone else is older than me. So it's like the millennial at the head, and kind of like running things a little bit differently. And my perspective on all of this is both being a millennial, but also being a boss or a manager in that way. Like for other people who are listening right now, like if you're a boss or a manager, this is affecting you as well. Because if you are seeing people leaving, right, you have to start strategically thinking about like, how can I keep my people? How can I keep people happy? How can I keep people satisfied at work? How do I make sure that they're doing the job that they love the most, right? And this is something I've always been very, I would say, focused on, meaning how do I make sure that everyone at work is always doing the work that they love to do, but also are very good at? Because going back to the whole perfect job idea, I don't think there's such a thing as a perfect job. And if you think that the perfect job is where you have 100% fun all the time, you're in for a really big, bumpy road. Because as someone who has started a business and is running a company and is doing something that they really enjoy, maybe 20% of the time is actually when I do work that I really truly enjoy. There's 80% of the work that I have to do that is not necessarily quote unquote fun, but has to be done. Just like if you want to be an author, right, and you want to get published, yes, the writing aspect might be really fun, but guess what? In order for you to be a successful author, there's like so many things you have to do that you don't particularly enjoy. You have to do the editing, you have to do the proofreading, you have to do the marketing, you have to do the selling, you have to do the promotion. There's all this other stuff you have to do outside of the thing that you enjoy doing most. And so when I think about like a perfect job is maybe, let's say 20% fun, and that's the thing you get to do the most and that really brings fulfillment. But the 80% of that is remaining is not going to be that fun, but it's still something that you have to do. So if you can hit that 20% threshold, I think you're doing an amazing job. Like that's a great job to have. And that's something that, especially if you're running a business, that's very true as well, because in the beginning, you have to do the accounting, you have to do the bookkeeping, you have to do the selling, the marketing, the operations, the product development, the customer service. Like there's so many things you have to do. And as your business grows, then you start to delegate these things, right? But if you have people under you, whether you're a manager or a boss or you're running your own company, like start thinking about like, what can you do to make people happier at work? Because again, happy people are productive people. That's the one thing I will always say and I will always repeat. And I've always been a very firm believer of autonomy. Like this is something a lot of people talk about in the self-help industry. If you read any book, by Adam Grant or other popular books that are out there that came out in the last 10 years, they all talk about like, if it comes to work-life balance or people being empowered at work, what's the number one thing you always hear? It's autonomy, right? And I'm curious to hear this from your perspective, Brooks, but when you came on and everyone else that came on in the company, like I was never the person who said, I'm going to micromanage you. I want to know exactly what time you showed up, what time you clocked out. I want to know your time budget. I want to know that you tracked your time. Like, I honestly did not care. Like, you could make your own decisions. I encourage you to make your own decisions. At the end of the day, though, I do care about results, and I want to make sure that those results are there. And those are usually very black and white. And when you run a remote company, especially, the results are very black and white. You either got it done or not. How you got it done, like, I don't really care as much. Well, I care to a certain degree, but like, if you do it in your pajamas, listening to the 80s music, right, on the beach somewhere, and the Zoom calls are fine, there's no baby crying in the background, everything is smooth, I'm happy. And the results are there, I'm happy, right? But if the results aren't there, then we need to talk. And so I think a lot of people, especially working in traditional industries, now being forced to move online, to work from home and that kind of stuff, are not used to that. And that, I think, is going to be a very tough transition over the next few years.
Well, it's funny you mentioned Adam Grant, because I came across this quote when he wrote an article in the Wall Street Journal about the Great Resignation, and he says the Great Resignation is not a mad dash away from the office; it's the culmination of a long march towards freedom, and that really kind of, like, I feel like links in exactly with what you were saying, where if you are an employee, you need to figure out what it is that you value kind of more than ever before. But on the flip side, if you are a manager or an employer, it's really incumbent on you to know that for each of your people. And I know that sounds like a lot of work, but if you want to keep people, it's almost like what it is you have to figure out these days. So you need to know, like, do you or do your people value flexibility, like time flexibility, low stress, working on interesting problems? Are you focused on money? Do they want to be recognized and a star? Some people do, some people don't. Do they want like rapid advancement? Do they want to be working on things that are like societally impactful? Like, it really does add a lot of burden, frankly, on the manager to know this about their people, so that they can be tailored a little more to give people what it is that they're looking for. Because sometimes, giving somebody a raise, will obviously usually be very, very welcome, but that might not be what motivates somebody. So if you're like all over HR to give your people raises, something you should always do, of course, but it might actually have very little impact on keeping people. Whereas maybe highlighting them, putting them on higher level meetings and that sort of thing, maybe that is what people are craving, getting recognition for the work that they're doing. So it's really on you to figure out what it is that people want. Another thing I would say also is, and maybe this is a little bit of a generational divide thing, I don't know, but you also need to recognize that people's needs and values are probably going to be different than yours. And this is really, really important, because you might be thinking, well, when, especially if you employ younger people, which is not, as Tan said, what Tan does, but if you're somebody who is that way, you might be thinking of, hey, I started in the mailroom. My job was answering phones and hand delivering mail to people's desks. And I had to put in my hours. So all these people should too, because that was your path to success, might not be the path that otherwise talented people want to follow. And it used to be that in the live stream, Alice mentioned that somebody she knows quit without having another job. And that's something that's very different than before too. It used to be, you'd be very rare that you would, especially for corporate jobs, it'd be very rare that you would leave a job without having another job lined up. In fact, it's almost like a stereotype comment, like it's easier to get a job when you have a job, which I think used to be the case, but now isn't. So you can't just assume that you're going to have a hold over your people until they find something else. People are just going to leave and then figure it out later. So as a manager, I think it really does. It's a lot trickier of a situation now than it used to be.
Well, as a manager and as a boss, this is something that you always have to think about, how do you keep your people? How do you keep them performing? How do you keep them happy? And honestly, this is something I think about like all the time. And what I found really helpful is a few things. One is when everyone comes on board, everyone takes different personality tests. So we have like wealth dynamics, we have Myers-Briggs and stuff like that, and Colby. And these things typically don't change as much. And the simplest version or analogy I can think of is, when you're married or you have a partner, you typically know how they like to be appreciated and how you like to communicate with them, right? So there's like this personality test called the 5 love languages, which I think most people have heard of. But if you haven't heard of this, it's basically the idea that everyone receives or feels connection in a certain way. And they have like 5 different ways that they talk about, like physical touch, words of affirmation, gifts, acts of service, and then there was one more. Oh, quality time. So I might, for example, feel really loved and have this sense of connection when I spend quality time with people, which is kind of like quote unquote my number one love language. But someone else might be gifts. And so if I spend a lot of time with that person, I'm subtly saying, hey, I really like you. Like I like spending time around you. And this is how I feel connection. But the other person might not feel the same way because their number one way of feeling connection and loved is like gifting, right? And it doesn't mean that it has to be expensive, but it's just like you thinking about them when you present something to them or something like that, right? And so it's the same thing with coworkers and also managers and bosses. Like you have to think about your people in that way as well. Like everyone is going to be slightly different, as you mentioned, Brooks. Like some people want recognition, some people want pay, some people want something else. Everyone is a little bit different. So how do we recognize those things and also adapt to them, because those things change over time, right? Last year you might not be motivated by money, but this year you might be. And if that has changed, let's talk about that and how we can best serve each other in that way, right? Just like if you just had a kid, you probably appreciate time flexibility a lot more than when you didn't have a kid, right? So there's all these things that change all the time. And as managers, we always have to be on top of things. And there's a few things that I find are easy things to do. So for example, I always believe that you want to overpay people, and overpaying above market value, because then money, in my opinion, should never be like the motivation for people to leave. Because if that's the number one reason people are leaving, then one, you started off paying them way too low, and two, there's always this form of resentment where they start thinking about that and they don't fully buy in, because if people feel underpaid, I just don't think you get the best out of people. So it's better to overpay, but also how can we make sure that people are always improving and growing? Hence, one of our core values at Asian Efficiency is glowing green, like making sure that you live your best life possible and always striving for greatness. And how do we make sure that the Brooks of 2021 is better than the Brooks of 2020, and the Brooks of 2020 was better than the Brooks of 2019, right? And there's different tools and stuff like that we can use for that. One of the things we use internally is called a skills matrix, which is basically, if you think about an X and Y axis, you have like skills on one axis and then the person's name on another. And then you have different skills that you then label out and you then color code them, like green being great. This person is really good at, copywriting or using the CRM or WordPress or whatever. And then if you plot it out across different team members, you can kind of color code it where green is great, yellow is like medium, red is, not that great, and then something else. Or you just leave it blank if it's non-existent. And so once you color code it, you can kind of see like, oh, this is where it is now. If you do that again 6 months later, you can kind of start seeing progression out visually, because now some things turn from yellow to green, and you go, oh my gosh, Brooks, like 6 months ago you were yellow at copywriting and this year you're at green. That's great, right? And now people have a sense of achievements and progress. And if we can tie it financially as well, that I think is even more motivating for a lot of people. And so as a manager, just keep thinking about like, how can you make sure that everyone you work with is happy? And this doesn't only include like the people that work under you or with you, but also people outside of your organization, like your vendors, the contractors that you use, right? Those are always people that you want to stay in touch with as well, and check in and make sure that they're happy with their pay that they're getting and how you guys are working together and stuff. Because again, if one of two of those are leaving, guess what? That's going to be have a major impact on you as well. So start thinking about that.
It's interesting you talk about the money piece, which, by the way, that is always one of my drivers, just in case you didn't know that. Just wanted to throw that out there. No, but I think anybody who works in corporate has experienced this or knows somebody who has experienced this, where you go and you say, okay, I'm leaving. Maybe you have another offer or something like that, or you say you're going to leave, and then all of a sudden, magically, your company is magically able to pay you more to try and get you to stay. And I think that is the sort of thing that people put up with for a long time, but are not going to be putting up with in the future. I think it's so frustrating for people when this happens, because the thinking is that, well, if you valued me at X dollars, you should have been paying me that all along, and not just when I'm walking out the door. And so I think that is something that I think employers are going to need to get ahead of, to figure out a way to stop this like underpaying until you don't have to game. Because, and I know if you're like a middle manager, a line manager, you may not have that much influence over that. It may be like your HR department, your compensation department, whatever, but it's something that happens all the time. And I think that is really going to end up coming back to bite a lot of organizations, because people just aren't going to put up with that stuff anymore.
So Brooks, let's end our podcast here, because I know we can talk about this forever and ever. And if you're listening to this right now, I would love to hear your feedback on what you think of the episode so far in terms of the format and the discussion and everything that's been shared so far. But as always, we want to make sure that things end in an actionable way. So here's my piece of advice, and something, Brooks, I want you to do next as well. But if you're thinking about leaving or exiting, I would highly recommend that you do it on good terms. Because one thing I've learned being in business over the last decade plus is that the world is really small. Like, yes, we have 7+ billion people, but I still run into people all the time from a decade ago in some shape or form, whether we meet at a conference, whether we work at different companies now, or maybe later on, I try to recruit them to come work for me, or I try to recruit them to come work with me as some form of partnership. And many companies have started by recruiting former coworkers, managers, and bosses. Like, if you do the research, you'll start to see, for example, I know Evernote got started that way, where the CEO was recruiting so many people that he used to work with because he knew he could trust them and rely on them to get the job done. And so you just never know what's going to happen next. So yes, you should, advance your skills and move to a different job if you're currently unhappy, but do it in such a way that you leave with class and do it on good terms. Because again, you will be surprised how those connections will come into your favor later on. So, go ahead, leave that job if you don't feel like this is the right place. Become something so good at something that they can't ignore you, which is one of the favorite phrases and ideas that I've seen over the last few years. And if there's one thing I would say, is just become so good at something, like at least one skill, ideally two, that people just want to flock to you and say, hey, I want you to come work with me, or we can start a new business together, or you're just being highly desirable in the marketplace that way. Because if you can be really good at something, like world class at it, like you will never have a problem doing something.
Yeah, I think we've all seen these things going around virally, these screenshots that people share about maybe text message threads with their boss or something like that, or their now former boss, where their boss makes some unreasonable demand and they end up getting in an argument and they end up quitting, and then they post the screenshot and it goes all over the place. And there's usually a lot of profanity involved. There's even a Reddit called, I think, anti-work, that's all about that stuff of stuff going on with your people's employers when they quit badly. And yeah, it is like entertaining as us as the reader to see this stuff. But if I was having this conversation with my kids, for example, I would advise them like never, ever, ever, ever quit in that way, even if the person deserves it. You just never know. Like, for example, every job I've ever had, except one, has been from somebody getting me in, somebody I went to school with, somebody I worked with in the past. In fact, this one guy, going back, speaking of referral bonuses, this one guy has gotten me into 3 different jobs. So that guy made a lot of money off me, let's just say. And just to show how old I am, the one job that I didn't get in from somebody was literally from a help ad in a newspaper. That was my first office job, was a help ad in a newspaper. But every other one has been from people I work with, and you just never know when that person you worked with 3 jobs ago, even if they don't get you in, you may find out that that person works in the company you're trying to get into or the organization. And if you left in a bad way in one place, it can really mess you up in a future place. I've seen that before as well. So yeah, really focus on the way you leave, because that's almost as important as the way you get in this environment where people are jumping job to job to job to job. All right, Tan. So we always like to end these episodes with a specific action item that people will take. What should people do as a result of this episode?
So if you made it this far, I would say make a value audit of yourself. And what I mean with this is try to recognize, or maybe even write down, what is important in your work and what do you not want. And I think once you become crystal clear on what that is, right, what's important to you and what is something that is not that important to you, use that information to evaluate your current situation and whether you then want to make the leap or continue to stay where you are. And so make an informed decision of what you want to do next. And I think this exercise will really help with that. So thank you again for listening. And next week's episode is all about how to do a calendar cleanup. So we're going to get into the nitty gritty of how to do that stuff and share some cool, nifty calendar workflows that I think you're going to be really enjoying. And that all the things that we've talked about today, including all the recommendations, you can find them in our show notes by going to theproductivityshow.com/380. So thanks again for joining us, and we'll see you next Productive Monday.